This is a reading of A Honeymoon in Space by George Chetwynd Griffith, which is in the public domain. Prologue. THE First Cruise OFTHE Astronef. About 8 o'clock on the morning of the 5th of November, 1900, those of the passengers and crew of the American liner St. Louis, who happened, whether from causes of duty or of their own pleasure, to be on deck, had a very strange, in fact a quite unprecedented experience. The big ship was ploughing her way through the long, smooth rollers at her average 21 knots towards the rising sun, when the officer in charge of the navigating bridge happened to turn his glasses straight ahead. He took them down from his eyes, rubbed the two object glasses with the cuff of his coat, and looked again. The sun was shining through a haze which so far dimmed the solar disk that it was possible to look straight at it without inconvenience to the eyes. The officer took another long squint, put his glasses down, rubbed his eyes and took another, and murmured, "Well, I'm damned." Just then, the fourth officer came up onto the bridge to relieve his senior while he went down for a cup of coffee and a biscuit. The second took him away to the other end of the bridge, out of hearing of the helmsman and the quartermaster standing by, and said almost in a whisper, "Say, Norton, there's something ahead there that I can't make out." Just as the sun got clear above the horizon, I saw a black spot go straight across it, right through the upper and lower limbs. I looked again, and it was plumb in the middle of the disk. "Look," he went on, speaking louder in his growing excitement. "There it is again. I can see it without the glasses now. See?" The fourth did not reply at once. He had the glasses close to his eyes and was moving them slowly about as though he were following some shifting object in the sky. Then he handed them back and said, "If I didn't believe the thing was impossible, I should say that's an airship, but for the present, I guess I'd rather wait till it gets a bit nearer, if it's coming. Still, there is something. Seems to be getting bigger pretty fast, too. Perhaps it would be as well to notify the old man. What do you think?" "Guess we'd better," said the second. "Suppose you go down. Don't say anything except to him. We don't want any more excitement among the people than we can help." A fourth nodded and went down the steps, and the second began walking up and down the bridge, every now and then taking another squint ahead. Again and again the mysterious shape crossed the disk of the sun, always vertically, as though, whatever it might be, it was steering a direct course from the sun to the ship, its apparent rising and falling being due really to the dipping of her bows into the swells. "Well, Mr. Charteris, what's the trouble?" said the skipper as he reached the bridge. "Nothing wrong, I hope? Have you sighted a derelict or what? What in hell's that?" His hands went up to his eyes, and he stared for a few moments at the pale yellow oblate shape of the sun. At this moment, the St. Louis's head dipped again, and the captain saw something like a black line swiftly drawn across the sun from bottom to top. "That's what I wanted to call your attention to, sir," said the second in a low tone. "I first noticed it crossing the sun as it rose through the mist. I thought it was a spot of dirt on my glasses, but it has crossed the sun several times since then, and for some minutes seemed to remain dead in the middle of it. Later on it got quite a lot larger, and whatever it is, it's approaching us pretty rapidly. You see, it's quite plain to the naked eye now." By this time several of the crew and of the early loungers on deck had also caught sight of the strange thing which seemed to be hanging and swinging between the sky and the sea. People dived below for their glasses, knocked at their friends' stateroom doors, and told them to get up because something was flying towards the ship through the air, and in a very few minutes there were hundreds of passengers on deck in all varieties of early morning costume, and scores of glasses, held to anxious eyes, were being directed ahead. The glasses, however, soon became unnecessary, for the passengers had scarcely got up on deck before the mysterious object to the eastward at length took definite shape, and as it did so, mouths were opened as well as eyes, for the owners of the eyes and mouths beheld just then the strangest sight that travellers by sea or land had ever seen. Within the distance of about a mile, it swung round at right angles to the steamer's course, with a rapidity which plainly showed that it was entirely obedient to the control of a guiding intelligence, and hundreds of eager eyes on board the liner saw, sweeping down from the grey-blue of the early morning sky, a vessel whose hull seemed to be constructed of some metal which shone with a pale, steely lustre. It was pointed at both ends, the forward end being shaped something like a spur or ram. At the after end were two flickering, interlacing circles of a glittering greenish-yellow colour, apparently formed by two intersecting propellers driven at an enormous velocity. Behind these was a vertical fan of triangular shape. The craft appeared to be flat-bottomed, and for about a third of her length amidships, the upper half of her hull was covered with a curving, dome-like roof of glass. "She's an airship of some sort, there's no doubt about that," said the captain. "So I guess the great problem has got solved at last. And yet it ain't a balloon, because it's coming against the wind, and it's nothing of the aeroplane sort neither, because it hasn't planes or kites or any fixings of that kind. Still, it's made of something like metal and glass, and they must take a lot of keeping up. It's travelling at a pretty healthy speed too, getting on for 100 miles an hour, I should guess. Ah, he's going to speak us. Hope he's honest." Everybody on board the St. Louis was up on deck by this time, and the excitement rose to fever heat as the strange vessel swept down towards them from the middle sky, passed them like a flash of light, swung round the stern, and ranged up alongside to starboard some 20 feet from the bridge rail. She was about 120 feet long, with some 20 feet of depth and 30 of beam, and the captain and many of his officers and passengers were very much relieved to find that, as far as could be seen, she carried no weapons of offence. As she ranged up alongside, a sliding door opened in the glass-domed roof amidships, just opposite to the end of the St. Louis's bridge. A tall, fair-haired, clean-featured man of about 30, in grey flannels, tipped up his golf cap with his thumb and said, "Good morning, Captain. You remember me, I suppose? Had a fine passage so far. I thought I should meet you somewhere about here." The captain of the St. Louis, in common with everyone else on board, had already had his credulity stretched about as far as it would go, and he was beginning to wonder whether he was really awake. But when he heard the hail and recognized the speaker, he stared at him in blank, and, for the moment, speechless bewilderment. Then he got hold of his voice again and said, keeping as steady as he could, "Good morning, my lord. Guess I never expected to meet even you like this in the middle of the Atlantic. So the newspaper men were right for once in a way, and you have got an airship that will fly. And a good deal more than that, Captain, if she wants to. I am just taking a trial trip across the Atlantic before I start on a run round the solar system. Sounds like a lie, doesn't it? But it's coming off. Oh, good morning, Miss Rennick. Captain, may I come on board?" "By all means, my lord, only I'm afraid I daren't stop Uncle Sam's mails even for you." "There's no need for that, Captain, on a smooth sea like this," was the reply. "Just keep on as you are going and I'll come alongside." He put his head inside the door and called something up a speaking tube, which led to a glass-walled chamber in the forward part of the roof, where a motionless figure stood before a little steering wheel. The craft immediately began to edge nearer and nearer to the liner's rail, keeping speed so exactly with her that the threshold of the door touched the end of the bridge without a perceptible jar. Then the flannel-clad figure jumped onto the bridge and held out his hand to the captain. As they shook hands, he said in a low tone, "I want a word or two in private with you, as soon as possible." The commander saw a very serious meaning in his eyes. Besides, even if he had not made his appearance under such extraordinary circumstances, it was quite impossible that one of his social position and his wealth and influence could have made such a request without good reason for it, so he replied, "Certainly, my lord. Will you come down to my room?" Hundreds of anxious, curious eyes looked upon the tall, athletic figure and the regular-featured, bronzed, honest English face as Rollo Lennox Smeaton Aubrey, Earl of Redgrave, Baron Smeaton in the Peerage of England, and Viscount Aubrey in the Peerage of Ireland, followed the captain to his room through the parting crowd of passengers. He nodded to one or two familiar faces in the crowd, for he was an old Atlantic ferryman and had crossed 5 times with Captain Hawkins in the St. Louis. Then he caught sight of a well and fondly remembered face which he had not seen for over 2 years. It was a face which possessed at once the fair Anglo-Saxon skin, the firm and yet delicate Anglo-Saxon features, and the wavy wealth of the old Saxon gold-brown hair, but a pair of big, soft pansy eyes, fringed with long, curling black lashes, looked out from under dark, and perhaps just a trifle heavy eyebrows. And moreover, there was that indescribable expression in the curve of her lips and the pose of her head, to say nothing of a lissom, vivacious grace in her whole carriage which proclaimed her a daughter of the younger branch of the race that rules. Their eyes met for an instant, and Lord Redgrave was startled and even a trifle angered to see that she flushed up quickly, and that the momentary smile with which she greeted him died away as she turned her head aside. Still, he was a man accustomed to do what he wanted, and what he wanted to do just then was to shake hands with Lilla Zadie Rennick, and so he went straight towards her, raised his cap, and held out his hand, saying, first with a glance into her eyes, and then with one upward at the Astronef, "Good morning again, Miss Rennick. You see, it is done." "Good morning, Lord Redgrave," she replied, he thought, a little awkwardly. "Yes, I see you have kept your promise. What a pity it is too late. But I hope you will be able to stop long enough to tell us all about it. This is Mrs. Van Stuyler, who has taken me under her protection on my journey to Europe." His lordship returned the bow of a tall, somewhat hard-featured matron who looked dignified even in the somewhat nondescript costume which most of the ladies were wearing. But her eyes were kindly, and he said, "Very pleased to meet Mrs. Van Stuyler. I heard you were coming, and I was in hopes of catching you on the other side before you left. And now, if you will excuse me, I must go and have a chat with the skipper." He raised his cap again, and presently vanished from the curious eyes of the excited crowd through the door of the captain's apartment. Captain Hawkins closed the door of his sitting room as he entered, and said, "Now, my lord, I'm not going to ask you any questions to begin with, because if I once began I should never stop, and besides, perhaps you'd like to have your own say right away." "Perhaps that will be the shortest way," said his lordship. "The fact is, we've not only the remains of this Boer business on our hands, but we've had what is practically a declaration of war from France and Russia. Briefly, it's this way. A few weeks ago, while the Allies thought they were fighting the Boxers, it came to the knowledge of my brother, the Foreign Secretary, that the Sungli Yamen had concluded a secret treaty with Russia which practically annulled all our rights over the Yangtze Valley and gave Russia the right to bring her Northern Railway right down through China. As you know, we've stood a lot too much in that part of the world already. But we couldn't stand this, so, about 10 days ago, an ultimatum was sent declaring that the British government would consider any encroachment on the Yangtze Valley as an unfriendly act. Meanwhile, France chipped in with a notification that she was going to occupy Morocco as a compensation for Fashoda, and added a few nasty things about Egypt and other places. Of course we couldn't stand that either, so there was another ultimatum, and the upshot of it all was that I got a wire late last night from my brother telling me that war would almost certainly be declared today, and asking me for the use of this craft of mine as a sort of dispatch boat if she was ready. She is intended for something very much better than fighting purposes, so he couldn't ask me to use her as a warship. Besides, I am under a solemn obligation to her inventor, her creator in fact, for I've only built her, to blow her to pieces rather than allow her to be used as a fighting machine, except of course in sheer personal self-defense. There is the telegram from my brother, so you can see there's no mistake, and just after it came a messenger asking me, if the machine was a success, to bring this with me across the Atlantic as fast as I could come. It is the duplicate of an offensive and defensive alliance between Great Britain and the United States, of which the details had been arranged just as this complication arose. Another is coming across by a fast cruiser, and, of course, the news will have got to Washington by cable by this time. By the time you get to the entrance of the Channel, you will probably find it swarming with French cruisers and torpedo destroyers, so if you'll be advised by me, you'll leave Queenstown out and get as far north as possible." "Lord Redgrave," said the captain, putting out his hand, "I'm responsible for a good bit right here, and I don't know how to thank you enough. I guess that treaty's been given away back to France by some of our Irish statesmen by now, and it'd be mighty unhealthy for the St. Louis to fall in with a French or Russian cruiser." "That's all right, Captain," said Lord Redgrave, taking his hand. "I should have warned any other British or American ship. At the same time, I must confess that my motives in warning you were not entirely unselfish. The fact is, there's someone on board the St. Louis whom I should decidedly object to see taken off to France as a prisoner of war." "And may I ask who that is?" said Captain Hawkins. "Why not?" replied his lordship. "It's the young lady I spoke to on deck just now, Miss Rennick. Her father was the inventor of that craft of mine. No one would believe his theories. He was refused patents both in England and America on the ground of lack of practical utility. I met him about 2 years ago, that is to say, rather more than a year before his death, when I was stopping at Banff up in the Canadian Rockies. We made a traveller's acquaintance, and he told me about this idea of his. I was very much interested, but I'm afraid I must confess that I might not have taken it up practically if the professor hadn't happened to possess an exceedingly beautiful daughter. However, of course I'm pretty glad now that I did do it, though the experiments cost nearly £5,000, and the craft herself close on £250,000. Still, she is worth every penny of it, and I was bringing her over to offer to Miss Rennick as a wedding present, that is to say, if she'd have it, and me." Captain Hawkins looked up and said rather seriously, "Then, my lord, I presume you don't know—" "Don't know what?" "That Miss Rennick is crossing in the care of Mrs. Van Stuyler to be married in London next month." "The devil she is! And to whom, may I ask?" exclaimed his lordship, pulling himself up very straight. To the Marquis of Byfleet, son of the Duke of Doncaster. I wonder you didn't hear of it. The match was arranged last fall. From what people say, she's not very desperately in love with him, but, well, I fancy it's like rather too many of these Anglo-American matches. A couple of $1 million on one side, a title on the other, and mighty little real love between them. But, said Redgrave between his teeth, I didn't understand that Miss Rennick ever had a fortune. In fact, I'm quite certain that if her father had been a rich man, he'd have worked out his invention himself. Oh, the dollars aren't his. In fact, they won't be hers till she marries, replied the captain. They belong to her uncle, old Russell Rennick. He got in on the ground floor of the New York and Chicago ice trusts and made millions. He's going to spend some of them on making his niece a marchioness. That's about all there is to it. Oh, indeed, said Redgrave, still between his teeth. Well, considering that Byfleet is about as big a wastrel as ever disgraced the English aristocracy, I don't think either Miss Rennick or her uncle will make a very good bargain. However, of course, that's no affair of mine now. I remember that this Russell Rennick refused to finance his brother when he really wanted the money. He made a particularly bad bargain too then, though he didn't know it, for a dozen crafts like that, properly armed, would simply smash up the navies of the world and make sea power a private trust. After all, I'm not particularly sorry, because then it wouldn't have belonged to me. Well now, Captain, I'm going to ask you to give me a bit of breakfast when it's ready, and then I must be off. I want to be in Washington tonight. Tonight? What? 2,100 miles? Why not? Said Redgrave. I can do about 150 an hour through the atmosphere, and then, you see, if that isn't fast enough, I can rise outside the Earth's attraction, let it spin round, and then come down where I want to. Great Scott, remarked Captain Hawkins inadequately, but with emphasis. Well, my lord, I guess we'll go down to breakfast. Her breakfast was not quite ready, and so Lord Redgrave rejoined Miss Rennick and her chaperon on deck. All eyes and a good many glasses were still turned on the Astronef, which had now moved a few feet away from the liner's side and was running along, exactly keeping pace with her. It's so wonderful that even seeing doesn't seem believing, said the girl, when they had renewed their acquaintance of 2 years before. Well, he replied, it would be very easy to convince you. She shall come alongside again, and if you and Mrs. Van Stuyler will honour her by your presence for half an hour while breakfast is getting ready, I think I shall be able to convince you that she is not the airy fabric of a vision, but simply the realization in metal and glass and other things of visions which your father saw some years ago. There was no resisting an invitation put in such a way. Besides, the prospect of becoming the wonder and envy of every other woman on board was altogether too dazzling for words. Mrs. Van Stuyler looked a little aghast at the idea at first, but she too had something of the same feeling as Zaidie, and besides, there could hardly be any impropriety in accepting the invitation of one of the wealthiest and most distinguished noblemen in the British peerage. So, after a little demur and a slight manifestation of nervousness, she consented. Redgrave signalled to the man at the steering wheel. The Astronef slackened pace a little, dropped a yard or so, and slid up quite close to the bridge, rail again. Lord Redgrave got in first and ran a light gangway down onto the bridge. Zaidie and Mrs. Van Stuyler were carefully handed up. The next moment, the gangway was drawn up again. The sliding glass doors clashed to. The Astronef leapt a couple of 1,000 feet into the air, swept round to the westward in a magnificent curve, and vanished into the gloom of the upper mists. Chapter 1. The situation was one which was absolutely without parallel in all the history of courtship from the days of Mother Eve to those of Miss Lilla Zaidie Rennick. The nearest approach to it would have been the old-fashioned Tartar custom which made it lawful for a man to steal his best girl, if he could get her first, fling her across his horse's crupper, and ride away with her to his tent. But to the shocked senses of Mrs. Van Stuyler, the present adventure appeared a great deal more terrible than that. Both Zaidie and herself had sprung to their feet as soon as the upward rush of the Astronef had slackened and they were released from their seats. They looked down through the glass walls of what may be called the hurricane deck chamber of the Astronef, and saw below them a snowy sea of clouds just crimsoned by the rising sun. In this cloud sea, which spread like a wide-meshed veil between them and the earth, there were great irregular rifts which looked as big as continents on a map. These had a blue-grey background, or it might be more correct to say underground, and in the midst of one of these they saw a little black speck, which after a moment or two took the shape of a little toy ship, and presently they recognized it as the 11,000-ton liner which a few moments ago had been their ocean home. Mrs. Van Stuyler was shaking in every muscle, afflicted by a sort of St. Vitus's dance, induced by physical fear and outraged propriety. Quite apart from these, however, she experienced a third sensation which made for a nameless inquietude. She was a woman of the world, well versed in most of its ways, and she fully recognized that that single bound from the bridge rail of the Stong Lewis to the other side of the clouds had already carried her and her charge beyond the pale of human law. The same thought, mingled with other feelings, half of wonder and half of reawakened tenderness, was just then uppermost in Miss Sadie's mind. It was quite obvious that the man who could create and control such a marvellous vehicle as this could, morally as well as physically, lift himself beyond the reach of the conventions which civilized society had instituted for its own protection and government. He could do with them exactly as he pleased. They were utterly at his mercy. He might carry them away to some unexplored spot on one of the continents, or to some unknown island in the midst of the wide Pacific. He might even transport them into the midst of the awful solitudes which surround the poles. He could give them the choice between doing as he wished, submitting unconditionally to his will, or committing suicide by starvation. They had not even the option of jumping out, for they did not know how to open the sliding doors, and even if they had done, what feminine nerves could have faced a leap into that awful gulf which lay below them, a 2,000-foot dive through the clouds into the waters of the wintry Atlantic? They looked at each other in speechless, dazed amazement. Far away below them on the other side of the clouds, the St. Louis was steaming eastward, and with her were going the last hopes of the coronet, which was to be the matrimonial equivalent of Miss Sadie's beauty and Russell Rennick's millions. They were no longer of the world. Its laws could no longer protect them. Anything might happen, and that anything depended absolutely on the will of the Lord and Master of the extraordinary vessel which, for the present, was their only world. "My dearest Sadie," Mrs. Van Stuyler gasped, when she at length recovered the power of articulate speech, "what an entirely too awful thing this is! Why, it's abduction and nothing less. Indeed, it's worse, for he's taken us clean off the earth, and there's no more chance of rescue than if he took us to one of those planets he said he could go to. If I didn't feel a great responsibility for you, dear, I believe I should faint." By this time Miss Sadie had recovered a good deal of her usual composure. The excitement of the upward rush, and what was left of the momentary physical fear, had flushed her cheeks and lighted her eyes. Even Mrs. Van Stuyler thought her looking, if possible, more beautiful than she had done under the most favourable of terrestrial circumstances. There was a something else, too, which she didn't altogether like to see, a sort of resignation to her fate which, in a young lady situated as she was then, Mrs. Van Stuyler considered to be distinctly improper. "It is rather startling, isn't it?" she said, with hardly a trace of emotion in her voice. "But I have no doubt that everything will be all right in the end." "Everything all right, my dear Zadie? What on earth, or I might say under heaven, do you mean?" "I mean," replied Zadie even more composedly than before, and also with a little tightening of her lips, "that Lord Redgrave is the owner of this vessel, and that therefore it is quite impossible that anything out of the way could happen to us. I mean anything more out of the way than this wonderful jump from the sea to the sky has been, unless, of course, Lord Redgrave is going to take us for a voyage among the stars." "Zadie Rennick," said Mrs. Van Stuyler, bridling up into her most frigid dignity, "I am more than surprised to hear you talk in such a strain. Perfectly safe indeed. Has it not struck you that we are absolutely at this Lord Redgrave's mercy, that he can take us where he likes and treat us just as he pleases?" "My dear Mrs. Van," replied Zadie, dropping back into her familiar form of address, but speaking even more frigidly than her chaperon had done, "you seem to forget that, however extraordinary our situation may be just now, we are in the care of an English gentleman. Lord Redgrave was a friend of my father's, the only man who believed in his ideals, the only man who realized them, the only man—" "That you were ever in love with, eh?" said Mrs. Van Stuyler with a snap in her voice. "Is that so? Ah, I begin to see something now. And I think, if you possess your soul in patience, you will see something more before long," snapped Miss Zadie in reply. Then she stopped abruptly, and the flush on her cheek deepened, for at that moment Lord Redgrave came up the companion, way from the lower deck, carrying a big silver tray with a coffee pot, 3 cups and saucers, a rack of toast, and a couple of plates of bread and butter and cake. Just then a sort of social miracle happened. The fact was that Mrs. Van Stuyler had never before had her early coffee brought to her by a peer of the British realm. She thought it a little humiliating afterwards, but for the moment all sorts of conventional barriers seemed to melt away. After all, she was a woman, and some years ago she had been a young one. And Lord Redgrave was an almost perfect specimen of English manhood in its early prime. He was one of the richest peers in England, and he was bringing her coffee. As she said afterwards, she wilted, and she couldn't help it. "I'm afraid I have kept you waiting a long time for your coffee, ladies," said Redgrave, as he balanced the tray on one hand and drew a wicker table towards them with the other. "You see, there are only 2 of us on board this craft, and as my engineer is navigating the ship, I have to attend to the domestic arrangements." Mrs. Van Stuyler looked at him in the silence of mental paralysis. Miss Zaidie frowned, smiled, and then began to laugh. "Now, of all the cold-blooded English ways of putting things," she began. "I beg your pardon," said Lord Redgrave as he put the tray down on the table. "What Miss Rennick means, Lord Redgrave," interrupted Mrs. Van Stuyler, struggling out of her paralytic condition, "and what I too should like to say, is that under the circumstances, you think that I am not as penitent as I ought to be." "Is that so?" said Redgrave, with a glance and a smile mostly directed towards Miss Zaidie. "Well, to tell you the truth," he went on, "I am not a bit penitent. On the contrary, I am very glad to have been able to assist the fates as far as I have done." "Assist the fates!" gasped Mrs. Van Stuyler, helping herself shakingly to sugar, while Miss Zaidie folded a gossamer slice of bread and butter and began to eat it. "I think, Lord Redgrave, that if you knew all the circumstances, you would say that you were working against them." "My dear Mrs. Van Stuyler," he replied, as he filled his own coffee cup, "I quite agree with you as to certain fates, but the fates which I mean are the ones which, with good or bad reason, I think are working on my side. Besides, I do know all the circumstances, or at least the most important of them. That knowledge is, in fact, my principal excuse for bringing you so unceremoniously above the clouds." As he said this, he took a sideway glance at Miss Zaidie. She dropped her eyelids and went on eating her bread and butter, but there was a little deepening of the flush on her cheeks which was to him as the first flush of sunrise to a benighted wanderer. There was a rather awkward silence after this. Miss Zaidie stirred the coffee in her cup with a dainty Queen Anne spoon, and seemed to concentrate the whole of her attention upon the operation. Then Mrs. Van Stuyler took a sip out of her cup and said, "But really, Lord Redgrave, I feel that I must ask you whether you think that what you have done during the last few minutes, which already, I assure you, seem hours to me, is, well, quite in accordance with the, what shall I say? The rules that we have been accustomed to live under." Lord Redgrave looked at Miss Zaidie again. She didn't even raise her eyelids. Only a very slight tremor of her hand as she raised her cup to her lips told that she was even listening. He took courage from this sign and replied, "My dear Mrs. Van Stuyler, the only answer that I can make to that just now is to remind you that, by the sanction of ages, everything is supposed to be fair under 2 sets of circumstances, and, whatever is happening on the earth down yonder, we, I think, are not at war." The next moment Miss Zaidie's eyelids lifted a little. There was a tremor about her lips almost too faint to be perceptible, and the slightest possible tinge of colour crept upwards towards her eyes. She put her cup down and got up, walked towards the glass walls of the deck chamber, and looked out over the cloudscape. The shortness of her steamer skirt made it possible for Lord Redgrave and Mrs. Van Stuyler to see that the sole of her right boot was swinging up and down on the heel ever so slightly. They came simultaneously to the conclusion that if she had been alone she would have stamped, and stamped pretty hard. Possibly also she would have said things to herself and the surrounding silence. This seemed probable from the almost equally imperceptible motion of her shapely shoulders. Mrs. Van Stuyler recognized in a moment that her charge was getting angry. She knew by experience that Miss Zaidie possessed a very proper spirit of her own, and that it was just as well not to push matters too far. She further recognized that the circumstances were extraordinary, not to say equivocal, and that she herself occupied a distinctly peculiar position. She had accepted the charge of Miss Zaidie from her Uncle Russell for a consideration counted partly by social advantages and partly by dollars. In the most perfect innocence, she had permitted not only her charge but herself to be abducted. For, after all, that was what it came to, from the deck of an American liner, and carried not only beyond the clouds but also beyond the reach of human law, both criminal and conventional. Inwardly she was simply fuming with rage. As she said afterwards, she felt just like a bottled volcano which would like to go off and daren't. About 2 minutes of somewhat surcharged silence passed. Mrs. Van Stuyler sipped her coffee in ostentatiously small sips. Lord Redgrave took his in slower and longer ones and helped himself to bread and butter. Miss Zaidie appeared perfectly contented with her contemplation of the clouds. Chapter 2. At length, Mrs. Van Stuyler, being a woman of large experience and some social deftness, recognized that a change of subject was the easiest way of retreat out of a rather difficult situation. So she put her cup down, leant back in her chair, and, looking straight into Lord Redgrave's eyes, she said with purely feminine irrelevance, "I suppose you know, Lord Redgrave, that, when we left, the machine which we call in America manhood suffrage, which of course simply means the selection of a government by counting noses which may or may not have brains above them, was what some of our orators would call in full blast. If you are going to New York after Washington, as you said on the boat, we might find it a rather inconvenient time to arrive. The whole place will be chaos, you know, because when the citizen of the United States begins electioneering, New York is not a very nice place to stop in except for people who want excitement, and so if you will excuse me putting the question so directly, I should like to know what you just do mean to do." Lord Redgrave saw that she was going to add, "with us." But before he had time to say anything, Miss Zaidie turned round, walked deliberately towards her chair, sat down, poured herself out a fresh cup of coffee, added the milk and sugar with deliberation, and then, after a preliminary sip, said, with her cup poised halfway between her dainty lips and the table, "Mrs. Van, I've got an idea. I suppose it's inherited, for dear old Pop had plenty. Anyhow, we may as well get back to common-sense subjects. Now look here," she went on, switching an absolutely convincing glance straight into her host's eyes. "My father may have been a dreamer, but still he was a sound money man. He believed in honest dealings. He didn't believe in borrowing $100 gold and paying back in $50 silver. What's your opinion, Lord Redgrave? You don't do that sort of thing in England, do you? Uncle Russell is a sound money man too. He's got too much gold locked up to want silver for it." "My dear Zaidie," said Mrs. Van Stuyler, "what have democratic and republican politics and bimetallism got to do with a trip in this wonderful vessel which Pop told me years ago could go up to the stars if it ever was made?" "Why, just this: Lord Redgrave is an Englishman, and too rich to believe in anything but sound money, so is Uncle Russell, and there you have it, or should have." "I think I see what you mean, Miss Rennick," said their host, leaning back in his chair and folding his hands behind his head, as steamboat travellers are wont to do when seas are smooth and skies are blue. "The Astronef might come down like a vision from the clouds and preach the gospel of gold in electric rays of silver through the commonplace medium of the Morse code. How's that for poetry and practice?" "I quite agree with his lordship as regards the practice," said Mrs. Van Stuyler, talking somewhat rudely across him to Zaidie. "It would be an excellent use to put this wonderful invention to, and then I am sure his lordship would land us in Central Park so that we could go to your uncle's house right away." No, I'm afraid I must ask you to excuse me there, Mrs. Van Stuyler," said Redgrave, with a change of tone which Miss Zaidie appreciated with a swiftly veiled glance. "You see, I have placed myself beyond the law. I have, as you have been good enough to intimate, abducted, to put it brutally, 2 ladies from the deck of an Atlantic liner. Further, in doing so, I have selfishly spoiled the prospects of one of the ladies. But seriously, I really must go to Washington first." "I think, Lord Redgrave," interrupted Mrs. Van Stuyler, ignoring the last unfinished sentence and assuming her best Knickerbocker dignity, "if you will forgive me saying so, that is scarcely a subject for discussion here." "And if that's so," interrupted Miss Zaidie, "the less we say about it, the better. What I wanted to say was this: we all want the Republicans in, at least all of us that have much to lose. Now, if Lord Redgrave was to use this wonderful airship of his on the right side, why there wouldn't be any standing against it. I must say that until just now I had hardly contemplated turning the Astronef into an electioneering machine. Still, I admit that she might be made use of in a good cause, only I hope that we shan't want you to paste her over with election bills, eh? Or start handbill snowstorms from the deck, or kidnap Croker and Bryan just as you did us, for instance. If I could, I'm quite sure that I shouldn't have as pleasant guests as I have now on board the Astronef." "What do you think, Mrs. Van Stuyler?" "My dear Lord Redgrave," she replied, "that would be quite impossible. The idea of being shut up in a ship like this, which can soar not only from Earth, but beyond the clouds, with people who would find out your best secrets, and then perhaps shoot you so as to be the only possessors of them. Well, that would be foolishness indeed. Why, certainly it would, said Zaidie. The only use you could have for people like that would be to take them up above the clouds and drop them out. But suppose Lord Redgrave, took the Astronef down over New York and signalled messages from the sky at night with a searchlight. Good, said their host, getting up from his deck chair and stretching himself up straight, looking the while at Miss Zaidie's averted profile. That's gorgeously good. We might even turn the election. I'm for sound money all the time, if I may be permitted to speak American. English is quite good enough for us, Lord Redgrave, said Miss Zaidie a little stiffly. We may have improved on the old language a bit, still we understand it, and, well, we can forgive its shortcomings. But that isn't quite to the point. It seems to me, said Mrs. Van Stuyler, that we are getting nearly as far from the original subject as we are from the St. Louis. May I ask, Zaidie, what you really propose to do? Do is not for us to say, said Miss Zaidie, looking straight up to the glass roof of the deck chamber. You see, Mrs. Van, we're not free agents. We are not even first-class passengers who have paid their fares on a contract ticket which is supposed to get them there. If you'll pardon me saying so, said Lord Redgrave, stopping his walk up and down the deck, that is not quite the case. To put it in the most brutally material form, it is quite true that I have kidnapped you two ladies and taken you beyond the reach of earthly law. But there is another law, one which would bind a gentleman even if he were beyond the limits of the solar system, and so if you wish to be landed either in Washington or New York, it shall be done. You shall be put down within a carriage drive of your own residence, or of Mr. Russell Rennick's. I will myself see you to his door, and there we may say goodbye, and I will take my trip through the solar system alone. There was another pause after this, a pause pregnant with the fate of two lives. They looked at each other, Mrs. Van Stuyler at Zaidie, Zaidie at Lord Redgrave, and he at Mrs. Van Stuyler again. It was a kind of three-cornered duel of eyes, and the eyes said a good deal more than common human speech could have done. Then Lord Redgrave, in answer to the last glance from Zaidie's eyes, said slowly and deliberately, I don't want to take any undue advantage, but I think I am justified in making one condition. Of course I can take you beyond the limits of the world that we know, and to other worlds that we know little or nothing of. At least I could do so if I were not bound by a law as strong as gravitation itself. But now, as I said before, I just ask whether or not my guests, or, if you think it suits the circumstances better, my prisoners, shall be released unconditionally wherever they choose to be landed. He paused for a moment, and then, looking straight into Zaidie's eyes, he added, The one condition I make is that the vote shall be unanimous. Under the circumstances, Lord Redgrave, said Mrs. Van Stuyler, rising from her seat and walking towards him with all the dignity that would have been hers in her own drawing-room. There can only be one answer to that. Your guests, or your prisoners, as you choose to call them, must be released unconditionally. Lord Redgrave heard these words as a man might hear words in a dream. Zaidie had risen too. They were looking into each other's eyes, and many unspoken words were passing between them. There was a little silence, and then, to Mrs. Van Stuyler's unutterable horror, Zaidie said, with just the suspicion of a gasp in her voice, There's one dissentient. We are prisoners, and I guess I'd better surrender at discretion. The next moment her captor's arm was round her waist, and Mrs. Van Stuyler, with her twitching fingers linked behind her back and her nose at an angle of 60 degrees, was staring away through the blue immensity, dumbly wondering what on earth or under heaven was going to happen next. Chapter 3. After a couple of minutes of silence which could be felt, Mrs. Van Stuyler turned round and said angrily, Zaidie, you will excuse me, perhaps, if I say that your conduct is not. Has not been what I should have expected, what I did, indeed, expect from your uncle's niece when I undertook to take you to Europe. I must say, if I were you, Mrs. Van, I don't think I'd say much more about that, because, you see, it's fixed and done. Of course, Lord Redgrave's only an earl, and the other is a marquis, but, you see, he's a man, and I don't quite think the other one is, and that's about all there is to it. Their host had just left the deck saloon, taking the early coffee apparatus with him, and Miss Zaidie, in the first flush of her pride and refound happiness, was taking a promenade of about 12 strides each way, while Mrs. Van Stuyler, after partially relieving her feelings as above, had seated herself stiffly in her wicker chair, and was following her with eyes which were critical, and if they had been 20 years younger, might also have been envious. "Well, at least I suppose I must congratulate you on your ability to accommodate yourself to most extraordinary circumstances. I must say that as far as that goes, I quite envy you. I feel as though I ought to choke or take poison, or something of that sort." "Sakes, Mrs. Van, please don't talk like that," said Zaidie, stopping in her walk just in front of her chaperone's chair. "Can't you see that there's nothing extraordinary about the circumstances except this wonderful ship? I have told you how Pop and I met Lord Redgrave in our tour through the Canadian Rockies 2 or 3 years ago. No, it's 2 years and 9 months next June, and how he took an interest in Pop's theories and ideas about this same ship that we are on now." "Oh yes," said Mrs. Van Stuyler rather acidly, "and not only in the abstract ideas, but apparently in a certain concrete reality." "Mrs. Van," laughed Zaidie with a cunning twist on her heel, "I know you don't mean to be rude, but— well, now did anyone ever call you a concrete reality?" "Of course it's correct, just as a scientific definition, perhaps. Still, anyhow, I guess it's not much good going on about that. The facts are just this way. I consented to marry that Byfleet Marquis just out of sheer spite and blank ignorance. Lord Redgrave never actually asked me to marry him when we were in the Rockies, but he did say when he went back to England that as soon as he had realised my father's ideal, he would come over and try and realise one of his own. He was looking at me when he said it, and he looked a good deal more than he said. Then he went away, and poor Pop died. Of course I couldn't write and tell him, and I suppose he was too proud to write before he'd done what he undertook to do. And I, like most girl-fools in the same place would have done, thought that he'd given the whole thing up and just looked upon the trip as a sort of interlude in globe-trotting, and thought no more about Pop's ideas and inventions than he did about his daughter. Very natural." "Of course," said Mrs. Van Stuyler, somewhat mollified by the subdued passion which Zaidie had managed to put into her commonplace words. "And so as you thought he had forgotten you and was finding a wife in his own country, and a possible husband came over from that same country with a coronet." "That'll do, Mrs. Van, thank you," interrupted Miss Zaidie, bringing her daintily shod foot down on the deck this time with an unmistakable stamp. "We'll consider that incident closed, if you please. It was a miserable, mean, sordid business altogether. I am utterly, hopelessly ashamed of it, and myself too. Just to think that I could ever—" Mrs. Van Stuyler cut short her indignant flow of words by a sudden uplifting of her eyelids and a swift turn of her head towards the companionway. Zaidie stamped again, this time more softly, and walked away to have another look at the clouds. "Why, what on earth is the matter?" she exclaimed, shrinking back from the glass wall. "There's nothing. We're not anywhere." "Pardon me, Miss Rennick, you are on board the Astronef," said Lord Redgrave as he reached the top of the companionway, "and the Astronef is at present travelling at about 150 miles an hour above the clouds towards Washington. That is why you don't see the clouds and sea as you did after we left the St. Louis. At a speed like this, they simply make a sort of grey-green blur. We shall be in Washington this evening, I hope." "Tonight, sir, I beg your pardon, my lord," gasped Mrs. Van Stuyler. 150 miles an hour, surely that's impossible." "My dear Mrs. Van Stuyler," said Redgrave with a side look at Zaidie, "nowadays impossible is hardly an English or even an American word. In fact, since I have had the honour of realising some of Professor Rennick's ideas, it has been relegated to the domain of mathematics. Not even he could make 2 and 2 more or less than 4, but, well, would you like to come into the conning tower and see for yourselves? I can show you a few experiments that will, at any rate, help to pass the time between here and Washington." "Lord Redgrave," said Mrs. Van Stuyler, dropping gracefully back into her wicker armchair, "if I may say so, I have seen quite enough impossibilities, and, other things, since we left the deck of the St. Louis to keep me quite satisfied until, with your lordship's permission, I set foot on solid ground again, and I should also like to remind you that we have left everything behind us on the St. Louis. Everything except what we stand up in, and therefore it will be a point of honour with me to see that you want for nothing while you are on board the Astronef, and that you shall be released from your durance. Now, don't say vile Lennox, I mean—" "It is perfectly plain what you mean, Zaidie," said Mrs. Van Stuyler, in a tone which seemed to send a chill through the deck chamber. "Really, the American girl—" "Just wants to tell the truth," laughed Zaidie, going towards Redgrave. "Lord Redgrave, if you like it better, says he wants to marry me, and, peer or peasant, I want to marry him, and that's all there is to it." "You don't suppose I'd have—" "My dear girl, there's no need to go into details," interrupted Mrs. Van Stuyler, inspired by fond memories of her own youth. "We will take that for granted, and as we are beyond the social region in which chaperons are supposed to be necessary, I think I will have a nap. And we'll go to the conning tower, eh? Breakfast will be ready in about half an hour, said Redgrave, as he took Zaidie by the arm and led her towards the forward end of the deck chamber. Meanwhile, au revoir. If you want anything, touch the button at your right hand, just as you would on board the St. Louis. I thank your lordship, said Mrs. Van Stuyler, half melting and half icy still. I shall be quite content to wait until you come back. Really, I feel quite sleepy. That's the effect of the elevation on the dear old lady's nerves, Redgrave whispered to Zaidie as he helped her up the narrow stairway which led to the glass-domed conning tower, in which in days to come she was destined to pass some of the most delightful and the most terrible moments of her life. Then why doesn't it affect me that way? Said Zaidie, as she took her place in the little chamber, steel-walled and glass-roofed, and half-filled with instruments of which she, Vassar girl and all as she was, could only guess the use. Well, to begin with, you are younger, which is an absolutely unnecessary observation, and in the second place, perhaps you were thinking about something else, by which I suppose you mean your lordship's noble self. This was said in such a tone and with such an indescribable smile that there immediately ensued a gap in the conversation, and a silence which was a great deal more eloquent than any words could have made it. When Miss Zaidie had got free again, she put her hands up to her hair, and while she was patting it into something like shape again, she said, "But I thought you brought me here to show me some experiments, and not to take advantage of the first real opportunity of tasting some of the dearest delights that mortal man ever stole from earth or sea. Do you remember that day when we were coming down from the big glacier, when your foot slipped and I just caught you and saved a sprained ankle? Yes, you wretch, and went away next day and left something like a broken heart behind you. Why didn't you? Oh, what idiots you men can be when you put your minds to it." "It wasn't quite that, Zaidie. You see, I'd promised your father the day before. Of course, I was only a younger son then, that I wouldn't say anything about realizing my ideal until I had realized his, and so I might have gone to Europe with Uncle Russell's millions to buy that man Byfleet's coronet and pay the price. Don't, Zaidie, don't. That is quite too horrible to think of. And as for the coronet, well, I think I can give you one about as good as his, and one that doesn't want regilding. Good Lord, fancy you married to a thing like that. What could have made you think of it?" "Ah, I didn't think," she said angrily. "I didn't think and I didn't feel. Of course I thought that I'd dropped right out of your life, and after that I didn't care. I was mad right through, and I'd made up my mind to do what others did. Take a title and a big position and have the outside as bright as I could get it, whatever the inside might be like. I'd made up my mind to be a society queen abroad and a miserable woman at home, and, Lennox, thank God and you that I wasn't." Then there was another interlude, and at the end of it Redgrave said, "Wait till we've finished our honeymoon in space and come back to Earth. You won't want any coronets then, although you'll have one, for all the lands of Earth won't hold another woman like yourself, your own sweet self. Of course it doesn't now, but there, you know what I mean. You'll have been to other worlds, you'll have made the round trip of the solar system, so to say, and I think, dear, that is about promise of wonders enough, and of other things too. No, you are really quite too exacting. I thought you brought me here to show me some of the wonders that this marvellous ship of yours can work. Then just one more, and I'll show you. Now you stand up there on that step, so that you can see all round, and watch with all your eyes, because you are going to see something that no woman ever saw before." Chapter 4. Above a tiny little writing desk, fixed to the wall of the conning tower, there was a square mahogany board with 6 white buttons in pairs. On one side of the board hung a telephone, and on the other a speaking tube. To the right hand opposite where Zaidie stood were 2 nickel-plated wheels, and behind each of them a white disc, one marked off into 360 degrees, and the other into 100 with subdivisions of tens. Overhead hung an ordinary tell-tale compass, and compactly placed on other parts of the wall were barometers, thermometers, barographs, and, in fact, practically every instrument that the most exacting of aeronauts or space explorers could have asked for. You see, Zaidie, this is what one might call the cerebral chamber of the Astronef, and, granted that my engines worked all right, I could make her do anything I wanted without moving out of here, but as a rule, of course, Murgatroyd is in the engine room. If he wasn't the most whole-souled Wesleyan that Yorkshire ever produced, I believe he'd become an idolater and worship the Astronef's engines. And who is Murgatroyd, please? In the first place, he is what I might call an hereditary retainer of the House of Redgrave. His ancestors have served mine for the last 700 years. When my ancestors were burglar, barons, his were men at arms. When we went on the Crusades, they went too. When we raised a regiment for the king against the Parliament, they were naturally the first to enlist in it, and as we gradually settled down into peaceful respectability, they did the same. Lastly, when we went into trade as iron masters and engineers, they went in too. This Murgatroyd, for instance, was master foreman of my works at Smeaton, and he was the only man I dared trust with the secrets of the Astronef, and the only one I would trust myself on board her with, and that's why we're a crew of 2. You see, the command of a vessel like this is a fairly big business, and if it got into the wrong sort of hands— Yes, I see, said Zadie with a little nod. It would be just too awful to think about. Why, you might keep the world in terror with it, but I know you wouldn't do that, because, for one thing, I wouldn't let you. Gently, mamselle, permit me most humbly to remind you that you are still my prisoner, and that I am still commander of the Astronef. Oh, very well then, said Zadie, interrupting him with a pretty little gesture of impatience. And now suppose you let me see what the Astronef's commander can do with her. Certainly, replied Redgrave, and with the greatest pleasure. But, by the way, that reminds me you haven't paid your footing yet. When due payment had been given and taken, or perhaps it would be more correct to say taken and given, Redgrave put his finger on one of the buttons. Immediately Zadie heard the swish of the air past the smooth wall of the conning tower grow fainter and fainter. Then there came a little check which nearly upset her balance, and presently the clouds beneath them began to take shape, and great white continents of them with grey oceans in between went sweeping silently and swiftly away behind them. Redgrave turned the wheel in front of the 100-degree disc a little to the left. The next instant the clouds rose up. For a moment Zadie could see nothing but white mist on all sides. Then the atmosphere cleared again, and she saw far below her what looked like a vast expanse of ocean that had been suddenly frozen solid. There were the long Atlantic rollers tipped with snowy foam. Here and there at wide intervals were little black dots, some of them with brown trails behind them, others with little patches of white which showed up distinctly against the dark grey blue of the sea. Every moment they grew bigger. Then the white-crested waves began to move, and the big ocean steamers and full-rigged sailing ships looked less and less like toys. Just under them there was a very big one with 4 funnels pouring out dense volumes of black smoke. Redgrave took up a pair of glasses, looked at her for a moment and said, "That's the Deutschland, the new Hamburg American record breaker. Suppose we go down and have a lark with her. I wonder if she's taking news of the war. We're in with Germany, and they may know something about it." "That would be just too lovely," said Zadie. "Let's go and show them how we can break records. I suppose they've seen us by this time and are just wondering with all their wits what we are. I guess they'll feel pretty tired about poor Count Zeppelin's balloon when they see us." Redgrave noted the we and the us with much secret satisfaction. "All right," he said, "we'll go and give them a bit of a startler." In front of the conning tower, there was a steel flagstaff about 10 feet high, with halyards rove through a sheer in the top. He took a little roll of bunting out of a locker under the desk, opened a glass slide, brought in the halyards, and bent the flag on. Meanwhile, the long shape of the great liner was getting bigger and bigger. Her decks were black, with people staring up at this strange apparition which was dropping upon them from the clouds. Another minute, and the Astronef had dropped to within 500 feet of the water, and about half a mile astern of the Deutschland. Redgrave turned the wheel back 2 or 3 inches and touched a second button. The Astronef stopped her descent instantly, and then she shot forward. The new Greyhound was making her 22.5 knots, hurling a broad white torrent of foam away from under her counters. But in half a minute the Astronef was alongside her. Redgrave ran the roll of bunting up to the top of the flagstaff, pulled one of the halyards, and the white ensign of England floated out. Almost at the same moment the German flag went up to the staff at the stern of the Deutschland, and they heard a roar of cheers, mingled with cries of wonder, come up from her swarming decks. Each flag was dipped thrice in due course. Redgrave took off his cap and bowed to the captain on the bridge. Zadie nodded and fluttered her handkerchief in reply to hundreds of others that were waving on the decks. Mrs. Van Stuyler woke up in wonder and waved hers instinctively, half longing to change crafts. In fact, if it hadn't been for her absolute devotion to the proprieties, she would have obeyed her first impulse and asked Lord Redgrave to put her on board the steamer. While the officers and crew and passengers of the Deutschland were staring wide-eyed and open-mouthed at the graceful glittering shape of the Astronef, Redgrave touched the first button in the second row once, moved the 100-degree wheel on a few degrees, and then gave the other a quarter turn. Then he closed the window slide, and the next moment Zadie saw the great liner sink down beneath them in a curious twisting sort of way. She seemed to stop still and then spin round on her centre, getting smaller and smaller every moment. "What's the matter, Lennox?" she said with a little gasp. "What's the Deutschland doing? She seems to be spinning round on her own axis like a top." "That's only the point of view, dear. She's just plugging along straight on her way to New York, and we've been making rings round her and going up all the time. But of course you don't notice the motion here any more than you would if you were in a balloon." "But I thought you were going to speak them. Surely you don't mean to say that you intended that just as a little bit of showing off?" "That's about what it comes to, I suppose, but you must not think it was altogether vanity. You see, the German government has bought Count Zeppelin's airship, or steerable balloon, as it ought to be called, always supposing that they can steer it in a wind, and of course their idea is to make a fighting machine of it. Now Germany's engaged to stand by us in this trouble that's coming, and by way of cementing the alliance, I thought it was just as well to let the wily Teuton know that there's something flying the British flag which could make very small mincemeat of their gas bags." "And what about Old Glory?" said Miss Zadie. "The Astronef was built with English money and English skill, but she is the creature of American genius." "Of course she is. In fact, she is the first concrete symbol of the Anglo-American alliance. And when the daughter of her creator has gone into partnership with the man who made her, we'll have 2 flagstaffs, and the Jack and Old Glory will float side by side." "And meanwhile, where are we going?" asked Zadie after a moment's interval. "Ah, there we are through the clouds again. What makes us rise? Is that the force that Pop told me he discovered?" "I'll answer the last question first," said Redgrave. "That was the greatest of your father's discoveries. He got at the secret of gravitation and was able to analyze it into 2 separate forces, just as Volta did with electricity, positive and negative, or, to put it better, attractive and repulsive. 3 out of the 5 sets of engines in the Astronef developed the RR, force, as I call it for short. This wheel with the 100 degrees marked behind it regulates the development. The further I turn it this way to the right, the more the Rye force overcomes the attractive force of the Earth or any other planet that we may visit. Turn it back, and gravitation asserts itself. If I put this arrowhead on the wheel opposite 0, the weight of the Astronef is about 150 tons, and of course she would go down like a stone, and a very big one at that. At 10, she weighs nothing. That is to say, the R force exactly counteracts gravitation. At 11, she begins to rise. At 100, she would be hurled away from the Earth, like a shell from a 12-inch gun, or even faster. Now, watch." He took up the speaking tube. "Is she all tight everywhere, Andrew?" "Yes, my lord," came gurgling through the tube. Then Redgrave slowly turned the wheel till the indicator pointed to 25. Zadie, all eyes and wonder, saw a vast sea of glittering white spread out beneath them, an ocean of snow with grey-blue patches here and there. It sank away from under them till the patches became spots and the sunlit clouds a vast, luminous blur. The air about them grew marvellously clear and limpid. The sun blazed down on them with a 10-fold intensity of light, but Zadie was astonished to find that very little heat penetrated the glass walls and roof of the conning tower. "What an awful height!" she exclaimed, looking round at him with something like fear in her eyes. "How high are we, Lennox?" "You'll find afterwards that the Astronef doesn't take any account of high or low, or up or down," he replied, looking at the dial of an aneroid barometer by the side of him. "Roughly speaking, we're rather over 60,000 feet, say 10 miles, from the surface of the Atlantic. That's why I asked Andrew whether everything was tight. You see, we couldn't breathe the air there is outside there, too thin and cold, and so the Astronef makes her own atmosphere as we go along. But I won't spoil what you're going to see by any more of this. So if you please, we'll go down now and get along to Washington. Anyhow, I hope I've convinced you so far that I've kept my promise." "Yes, dear, you have, and splendidly. I've only one regret. If he was only here now, what a happy man he'd be. Still, I dare say he knows all about it and is just as happy. In fact, he must be. I feel certain he must. The very soul of his intellect was in the dream of this ship, and now that it's a reality, he must be here still. Isn't it part of himself? Isn't it his mind that's working in these wonderful engines of yours, and isn't it his strength that lifts us up from the earth and takes us down again just as you please to turn that wheel?" "There's little doubt about that, Zadie. said Redgrave quietly, but earnestly. "You know we North Country folk all have our traditions and our ghosts, and what more likely than that the spirit of a dead man or a man gone to other worlds should watch over the realization of his greatest work on earth? Why shouldn't we believe that, we who are going away from this world to other ones?" "Why not?" interrupted Zaidie. "Why, of course we will. And now suppose we come down in more ways than one, and go and give poor Mrs. Van Stuyler something to eat and drink. The dear old girl must be frightened half out of her wits by this time." "Very well," replied Redgrave, "but we'll come down literally first, so that we can get the propellers to work." He turned the wheel back till the indicator pointed to 5. The cloud sea came up with a rush. They passed through it and stopped about 1,000 feet above the sea. Redgrave touched the first button twice, and then the next one twice. The air began to hiss past the walls of the conning tower. The crest-crowned waves of the Atlantic seemed to sweep in a hurrying torrent behind them, and then Redgrave, having made sure that Murgatroyd was at the afterwheel, gave him the course for Washington, and then went down to induct his bride. Elect into the art and mystery of cooking by electricity, as it was done in the kitchen of the Astronef. Chapter 5. As this narrative is the story of the personal adventures of Lord Redgrave and his bride, and not an account of events at which all the world has already wondered, there is no necessity to describe in any detail the extraordinary sequence of circumstances which began when the Astronef dropped without warning from the clouds in front of the White House at Washington, and his lordship, after paying his respects to the President, proceeded to the British Embassy and placed the copy of the Anglo-American Agreement in Lord Pauncefaute's hands. Mrs. Van Stuyler's spirits had risen as the Astronef descended towards the lights of Washington, and when the President and Lord Pauncefautte paid a visit to the wonderful craft, the joint product of American genius and English capital and constructive skill, she immediately assumed, at Redgrave's request, the position of Lady of the House pro tem, and described the change of plans, as she called it, which led to their transfer from the St. Louis to the Astronef, with an imaginative fluency which would have done credit to the most enterprising of American interviewers. "You see, my dear," she said to Zaidie afterwards, "as everything turned out so very happily, and as Lord Redgrave behaved in such a splendid way, I thought it was my duty to make everything appear as pleasant to the President and Lord Pauncefautte as I could." "It was real good of you, Mrs. Van," said Zaidie. "If I hadn't been paralysed with admiration, I believe I should have laughed. Now, if you'll just come with us on our trip, and write a book about it afterwards just as you told, I mean as you described what happened between the St. Louis and Washington to the President and Lord Pauncefautte, you'd make $1 million out of it. Say now, won't you come?" "My dear Zaidie," Mrs. Van Stuyler replied, "you know that I am very fond of you. If I'd only had a daughter, I should have wanted her to be just like you, and I should have wanted her to marry a man just like Lord Redgrave, but there's a limit to everything. You say that you are going to the moon and the stars, and to see what the other planets are like. Well, that's your affair. I hope God will forgive you for your presumption, and let you come back safe, but I know. 10, 20 millions wouldn't pay me to tempt Providence like that." The Astronef had landed in front of the White House, as everybody knows, on the eve of the presidential election. After dinner in the deck saloon, as the space navigator lay in the midst of a square of troops, outside which a huge crowd surged and struggled to get a look at the latest miracle of constructive science, the President and the British ambassador said goodbye, and as soon as the gangway ladder was drawn in the Astronef, moved by no visible agency, rose from the ground amidst a roar of cheers coming from 100,000 throats. She stopped at a height of about 1,000 feet, and then her forward searchlight flashed out, swept the horizon, and vanished. Then it flashed out again intermittently in the longs and shorts of the Morse code, and these, when translated, read, "Vote for sound men and sound money." In 5 minutes the wires of the United States were alive with the terse, pregnant message, and under the ocean in the dark depths of the Atlantic ooze, vivid narratives of the coming of the miracle went flashing to 100 newspaper offices in England and on the continent. The New York correspondent of the London Daily Express added the following paragraph to his account of the strange occurrence. "The secret of this amazing vessel, which has proved itself capable of traversing the Atlantic in a day, and of soaring beyond the limits of the atmosphere at will, is possessed by one man only, and that man is an English nobleman. The air is full of rumours of universal war. One vessel such as this could scatter terror over a continent in a few days, demoralise armies and fleets, reduce society to chaos, and establish a one-man despotism on the ruins of all the governments of the world. The man who could build one ship like this could build 50, and if his country asked him to do it, no doubt he would. Those who, as we are almost forced to believe, are even now contemplating a serious attempt to dethrone England from her supreme place among the nations of Europe, will do well to take this latest potential factor in the warfare of the immediate future into their most serious consideration. This paragraph was not perhaps as absolutely correct as a proposition in Euclid, but it stopped the war. The Deutschland came in the next day, and again the press was flooded, this time with personal narratives and brilliantly imaginative descriptions of the vision which had descended from the clouds, made rings round the great liner going at her best speed, and then vanished in an instant beyond the range of field glasses and telescopes. Thus did the creature of Professor Rennick's inventive genius play its first part as the peacemaker of the world. When the astronef's message had been duly given and recorded, her propellers began to revolve, and her head swung round to the northeast. So began, as all the world now knows, the most extraordinary electioneering trip that ever was known. First Baltimore, then Philadelphia, and then New York saw the flashes in the sky. There were illuminations, torchlight processions, and all the machinery of American electioneering going at full blast. And when people saw, far away up in the starlit night, those swiftly changing beams glittering down, as it were, out of infinite space, and when the telegraph operators caught on to the fact that they were signals, a sort of awe seemed to come over both Republicans and Democrats alike. Even Tammany's thoughts began to lift above the sordid level of boodle. It was almost like a message from another world. There was something supernatural about it, and when it was translated and rushed out in extra editions of the evening papers, "Vote for sound men and sound money" became the watchword of millions. From New York to Boston, Boston to Albany, and then across country to Buffalo, Cleveland, Chicago, Omaha. Then westward to St. Paul and Minneapolis, and northward to Portland and Seattle, southward to San Francisco and Monterey. Then eastward again to Salt Lake City, and then, after a leap across the Rockies which frightened Mrs. Van Stuyler almost to fainting point and made Zadie gasp for breath, away southward to Santa Fe and New Orleans. Then northward again up the Mississippi Valley to St. Louis, and thence eastward across the Alleghenies back to Washington. Such was the famous night voyage of the Astronef, and so by means of that long silver tongue of light did she spread the message of common sense and commercial honesty throughout the length and breadth of the great republic. If the world knows how America received and interpreted it the next day. Meanwhile, Mr. Russell Rennick had taken train to Washington, and the day after the election he willingly took back all that he had intended with regard to the Marquis of Byfleet, accepted Lord Redgrave in his stead, and bestowed his avuncular blessing at the wedding breakfast held in the deck chamber of the Astronef poised in mid-air, 500 feet above the dome of the Capitol, a week later. To this he added a check for $1 million, payable to the Countess of Redgrave on her return from her wedding trip. At Westover, the wedding party made an inspection of the wonderful vessel under the guidance of her commander. After this, while they were drinking their coffee and liqueurs, and the men were smoking their cigars in the deck chamber, a score of the most distinguished men and women in the United States experienced the novel sensation of sitting quietly in deck chairs while they were, being hurled at the rate of 150 miles an hour through the atmosphere. They ran up to Niagara, dropped to within a few feet of the surface of the falls, passed over them, fell to the rapids, and drifted down them within a couple of yards of the raging waters. Then in an instant they leapt up into the clouds, dropped again, and took a slanting course for Washington at a speed incredible, but to them quite imperceptible, save for the blurred rush of the half-visible earth behind them. That night the Astronef rested again in front of the steps of the White House, and Lord and Lady Redgrave were the guests at a semi-official banquet given by the newly re-elected president. The speech of the evening was made by the president himself in proposing the health of the bride and bridegroom, and this is the way he ended. There is something more in the ceremony which we have been privileged to witness than the union of a man and a woman in the bonds of holy matrimony. Lord Redgrave, as you know, is the descendant of one of the noblest and most ancient families in the motherland of new nations. Lady Redgrave is the daughter of the oldest and, I hope I may be allowed to say without offence, the greatest of those nations. It is perhaps early days to talk about a formal federation of the Anglo-Saxon people, but I think I am only voicing the sentiments of every good American when I say that, if the rumours which have drifted over and under the Atlantic, rumours of a determined attempt on the part of certain European powers to assault and, if possible, destroy that magnificent fortress of individual liberty and collective equity which we call the British Empire, should unhappily prove to be true, then it may be that the rest of the world will find that America does not speak English for nothing. But I must also remind you that a few yards from the doors of the White House there lies the greatest marvel, I had almost said the greatest miracle, that has ever been accomplished by human genius and human industry. That wonderful vessel, in which some of us have been privileged to take the most marvelous journey in the history of mechanical locomotion, was thought out by an American man of science, the man whose daughter sits on my right hand tonight. In her concrete material form, this vessel, destined to navigate the shoreless ocean of space, is English. But she is also the result of the belief and the faith of an Englishman in an American ideal. So when she leaves this earth, as she will do in an hour or so, to enter the confines of other worlds than this, and it may be to make the acquaintance of peoples other than those who inhabit the earth, she will have done infinitely more than she has already done, incredible as that seems. She will not only have convinced this world that the greatest triumph of human genius is of Anglo-Saxon origin, but she will carry to other worlds than this the truth which this world will have learnt before the 19th century ends. England in the person of Lord Redgrave, and America in the person of his Countess, leave this world tonight to tell the other worlds of our system, if haply they may find some intelligible means of communication, what this world, good and bad, is like. And it is within the bounds of possibility that in doing so they may inaugurate a wider fellowship of created beings than the limits of this world permit, a fellowship, a friendship, and, as the Astronef entitles us to believe, even a physical communication of world with world, which, in the dawn of the 20th century, may transcend in sober fact the wildest dreams of all the philanthropists and the philosophers who have sought to educate humanity from Socrates to Herbert Spencer. Chapter 6. After the Astronef's forward searchlight had flashed its farewells to the thronging, cheering crowds of Washington, her propellers began to whirl, and she swung round northward on her way to say goodbye to the Empire City. A little before midnight, her two lights flashed down over New York and Brooklyn, and were almost instantly answered by hundreds of electric beams streaming up from different parts of the Twin Cities, and from several men of war lying in the bay and the river. "Goodbye for the present. Have you any messages for Mars?" flickered out from above the Astronef's conning tower. What Uncle Sam's message was, if he had one, was never deciphered, for 50 beams began dotting and dashing at once, and the result was that nothing but a blur of many mingled rays reached the conning tower from which Lord Redgrave and his bride were taking their last look at human habitations. "You might have known that they would all answer at once," said Zadie. "I suppose the newspapers, of course, want interviews with the leading Martians, and the others want to know what there is to be done in the way of trade. Anyhow, it would be a feather in Uncle Sam's cap if he made the first reciprocity treaty with another world." "And then proceeded to corner the commerce of the solar system," laughed Redgrave. "Well, we'll see what can be done, although I think, as an Englishman, I ought to look after the open door." "So that the Germans could get in before you, eh? That's just like you, dear good-natured English. But look," she went on, pointing downwards, "they're signalling again, all at once this time." Half a dozen beams shone out together from the principal newspaper offices of New York. Then, simultaneously, they began the dotting and dashing again. Redgrave took them down in pencil, and when the signalling had stopped he read off, "No war. Dual Alliance climbs down. Don't like idea of Astronef. Cables just received. Goodbye and good luck. Come back soon and safe." "What? We have stopped the war!" exclaimed Zadie, clasping his arm. "Well, thank God for that. How could we begin our voyage better? You remember what we were saying the other day, Lennox? If that's only true, my father somewhere knows now what a blessing he has given his brother men. We've stopped a war which might have deluged the world in blood. We've saved perhaps hundreds of thousands of lives and kept sorrow from thousands of homes. Lennox, when we get back, you and the States and the British government will have to build a fleet of these ships, and then the Anglo-Saxon race must say to the rest of the world, 'The millennium has come, and its presiding goddess is Zadie Redgrave. If you don't stop fighting, disband your armies and turn your fleets into liners and cargo boats, she'll proceed to sink your ships and decimate your armies until you learn sense.' Is that what you mean, dear?" laughed Redgrave, as he slipped his left hand round her waist and laid his right on the searchlight switch to reply to the message. "Don't be ridiculous, Lennox. Still, I suppose that is something like it. They wouldn't deserve anything else if they were fools enough to go on fighting after they knew we could wipe them out." "Exactly. I perfectly agree with your ladyship, but still sufficient unto the day is the Armageddon thereof. Now, I suppose we'd better say goodbye and be off." "And what a goodbye," whispered Zadie with an upward glance into the starlit ocean of space which lay above and around them. "Goodbye to the world itself. Well, say it, Lennox, and let us go. I want to see what the others are like." "Very well then, goodbye it is," he said, beginning to jerk the switch backwards and forwards with irregular motions, sending short flashes and longer beams down towards the earth. The Empire City read the farewell message. "Thank God for the peace. Goodbye for the present. We shall convey the joint compliments of John Bull and Uncle Sam to the peoples of the planets when we find them. Au revoir." The message was answered by the blaze of the concentrated searchlights from land and sea, all directed on the Astronef. For a moment her shining shape glittered like a speck of diamond in the midst of the luminous haze far up in the sky, and then it vanished for many an anxious day from mortal sight. A few moments later, Zadie pointed over the stern and said, "Look, there's the moon. Just fancy, our first stopping place. Well, it doesn't look so very far off at present." Redgrave turned and saw the pale yellow crescent of the new moon swimming high above the eastern edge of the Atlantic Ocean. "It almost looks as if we could steer straight to it right over the water. Only, of course, it wouldn't wait there for us," she went on. "Oh, it'll be there when we want it, never fear," he laughed. "And, after all, it's only a mere matter of about 240,000 miles away, and what's that in a trip that will cover hundreds of millions? It will just be a sort of jumping-off place into space for us." "Still, I shouldn't like to miss seeing it," she said. "I want to see what there is on that other side which nobody has ever seen yet, and settle that question about air and water. Won't it just be heavenly to be able to come back and tell them all about it at home? But just fancy me talking stuff like this when we are going, perhaps, to solve some of the hidden mysteries of creation, and, maybe, look upon things that human eyes were never meant to see," she went on, with a sudden change in her voice. He felt a little shiver in the arm that was resting upon his, and his hand went down and caught hers. "Well, we shall see a good many marvels, and perhaps miracles, before we come back. But why should there be anything in creation that the eyes of created beings should not look upon? Anyhow, there's one thing we shall do. I hope. We shall solve once and for all the great problem of the worlds. Look, for instance," he went on, turning round and pointing to the west. "There is Venus following the sun. In a few days I hope you and I will be standing on her surface, perhaps trying to talk by signs with her inhabitants and taking photographs of her scenery. There's Mars too, that little red one up yonder. Before we come back we shall have settled a good many problems about him too. We shall have navigated the rings of Saturn and perhaps graphed them from his surface. We shall have crossed the bands of Jupiter and found out whether they are clouds or not. Perhaps we shall have landed on one of his moons and taken a voyage round him. Still, that's not the question just now, and if you are in a hurry to circumnavigate the moon, we'd better begin to get a wriggle on us, as they say down yonder, so come below and we'll shut up. A bit later I'll show you something that no human eyes have ever seen." "What's that?" she asked as they turned away towards the companion ladder. "I won't spoil it by telling you," he said, stopping at the top of the stairs and taking her by the shoulders. "By the way," he went on, "I may remind your ladyship that you are just now drawing the last breaths of earthly air which you will taste for some time, in fact, until we get back. And you may as well take your last look at Earth as Earth, for the next time you see it, it will be a planet." She turned to the open window and looked over into the enormous void beneath. For all this time the Astronef had been mounting swiftly towards the zenith. She could see, by the growing moonlight, vast, vague shapes of land and sea. The myriad lights of New York and Brooklyn were mingled in a tiny patch of dimly luminous haze. The air about her had suddenly grown bitterly cold, and she saw that the stars and planets were shining with a brilliancy she had never seen before. Redgrave came back to her, and laying his arm across her shoulder said, "Well, have you said goodbye to your native world? It is a bit solemn, isn't it, saying goodbye to a world that you have been born on, which contains everything that has made up your life, everything that is dear to you?" "Not quite everything," she said, looking up at him. "At least I don't think so." He lost no time in making the only reply which was appropriate under the circumstances, and then he said, drawing her close to him, "Nor I. As you know, darling, this is our world, a world travelling among worlds, and since I have been able to bring the most delightful of the Daughters of Terror with me, I, at any rate, am perfectly happy. Now, I think it's getting on to supper time, so if your ladyship will go to your household duties, I'll have a look at my engines and make everything snug for the voyage." The first thing he did when he left the conning tower was to hermetically close every external opening in the ship. Then he went and carefully inspected the apparatus for purifying the air and supplying it with fresh oxygen from the tanks in which it was stored in liquid form. Lastly, he descended into the lower hold and turned on the energy of repulsion to its fullest extent, at the same time stopping the engines which had been working the propellers. It was now no longer necessary or even possible to steer the Astronef. She was directed solely by the repulsive force which would carry her with ever-increasing swiftness as the attraction of the Earth diminished towards that neutral point at which the attraction of the Earth is exactly balanced by the Moon. Her momentum would carry her past this point, and then the R-force would be gradually brought into play in order to avert the unpleasant consequences of a fall of some 40-odd thousand miles. Andrew Murgatroyd, relieved from his duties in the wheelhouse, made a careful inspection of the auxiliary machinery, which was under his special charge, and then retired to his quarters in the after end of the vessel to prepare his own evening meal. Meanwhile, her ladyship, with the help of the ingenious contrivances with which the kitchen of the Astronef was stocked, had prepared a dainty little souper à deux. Her husband opened a bottle of the finest champagne that the cellars of Smeaton could supply, to drink to the prosperity of the voyage and the health of his beautiful fellow voyager. When he had filled the 2 tall glasses, the wine began to run over the side which was toward the stern of the vessel. They took no notice of this at first, but when Zaidie put her glass down, she stared at it for a moment and said in a half-frightened voice, "Why, what's the matter, Lennox? Look at the wine. It won't keep straight, and yet the table's perfectly level. And see, the water in the jug looks as though it were going to run up the side." Redgrave took up the glass and held it balanced in his hand. When he had got the surface of the wine level, the glass was no longer perpendicular to the table. "Ah, I see what it is," he said, taking another sip and putting the glass down. "You notice that, although the wine isn't lying straight in the glass, it isn't moving about, it's just as still as it would be on Earth. That means that our centre of gravity is not exactly in line with the centre of the Earth. We haven't quite swung into our proper position, and that reminds me, dear, you will have to be prepared for some rather curious experiences in that way. For instance, just see if that jug of water is as heavy as it ought to be." She took hold of the handle, and exerting, as she thought, just enough force to lift the jug a few inches, was astonished to find herself holding it out at arm's length with scarcely any effort. She put it down again very carefully, as though she were afraid it would go floating off the table, and said, looking rather scared, "That's very strange, but I suppose it's all perfectly natural." "Perfectly. It merely means that we have left Mother Earth a good long way behind us." "How far?" she asked. "I can't tell you exactly," he replied, "until I go to the instrument room and take the angles, but I should say roughly about 70,000 miles. When we've finished, we'll go and have coffee on the upper deck, and then we shall see something of the glories of space as no human eyes have ever seen them before." 70,000 miles away from home already, and we only started a couple of hours ago. Zaidie found the idea a trifle terrifying, and finished her meal almost in silence. When she got up, she was not a little disconcerted when the effort she made not only took her off her chair, but off her feet as well. She rose into the air nearly to the surface of the table. "Sakes," she said, "this is getting quite a little embarrassing. I shall be hitting my head against the roof next." "Oh, you'll soon get used to it," he laughed, pulling her down onto her feet by the skirt of her dress. "Always remember to exert very little strength in everything you do, and don't forget to do everything very slowly." When the coffee was made, he carried the apparatus up into the deck chamber. Then he came back and said, "You better wrap yourself up warmly. It's a good deal colder up there than it is here." When she reached the deck and took a first glance about her, Zaidie seemed suddenly to lapse into a state of somnambulism. The whole heavens above and around were strewn with thick clusters of stars which she had never seen before. The stars she remembered seeing from the Earth were only pinpoints in the darkness compared with the myriads of blazing orbs which were now shooting their rays across the black void of space. So many millions of new ones had come into view that she looked in vain for the familiar constellations. She saw only vast clusters of living gems of every colour crowding the heavens on every side of her. She walked slowly round the deck, gazing to right and left and above, incapable for the moment either of thought or speech, but only of dumb wonder mingled with a dumb sense of overwhelming awe. Presently she craned her neck backwards and looked straight up to the zenith. A huge silver crescent, supporting, as it were, a dim greenish-coloured body in its arms, stretched overhead across nearly a sixth of the heavens. Then Redgrave came to her side, took her in his arms, lifted her as if she had been a little child, and laid her in a long, low deck chair so that she could look at it without inconvenience. The splendid crescent seemed to be growing visibly bigger, and as she lay there in a trance of wonder and admiration, she saw point after point of dazzling white light flash out in the dark portions and then begin to send out rays as though they were gigantic volcanoes in full eruption and were pouring torrents of living fire from their blazing craters. "Sunrise on the moon," said Redgrave, who had stretched himself on another chair beside her. "A glorious sight, isn't it? But nothing to what we shall see tomorrow morning, only there doesn't happen to be any morning just about here." "Yes," she said dreamily. "Glorious, isn't it? That and all the stars, but I can't think anything yet. Lennox, it's all too mighty and too marvellous. It doesn't seem as though human eyes were meant to look upon things like this. But where's the earth? We must be able to see that still." "Not from here," he said, "because it's underneath us. Come below now, and you shall see what I promised you." They went down into the lower part of the vessel and to the after end behind the engine room. Redgrave switched on a couple of electric lights and then pulled a lever attached to one of the side walls. A part of the flooring about 6 feet square slid noiselessly away. Then he pulled another lever on the opposite side, and a similar piece disappeared, leaving a large space covered only by a thick plate of absolutely transparent glass. He switched off the lights again and led her to the edge of it, and said, "There is your native world, dear. That is your Mother Earth." Wonderful as the moon had seemed, the gorgeous spectacle which lay seemingly at her feet was infinitely more magnificent. A vast disk of silver grey, streaked and dotted with lines and points of dazzling lights, and more than half covered with vast, glimmering, greyish-green expanses, seemed to form the floor of the tremendous gulf beneath them. They were not yet too far away to make out the general features of the continents and oceans, and fortunately the hemisphere presented to them happened to be singularly free from clouds. To the right spread out the majestic outlines of the continents of North and South America, and to the left Asia, the Malay archipelago, and Australia. At the top was a vast, roughly circular area of dazzling whiteness, and Redgrave, pointing to this, said, "There, look up a little further north in the middle of that white patch, and you'll see what no eyes but yours and mine have ever seen, the North Pole. When we come back we shall see the South Pole, because we shall approach the earth from the other end, as it were. I suppose you recognise a good deal of the picture. All that bright part up to the north, with the black spots on it, is Canada. The black spots are forests. That long white line to the left is the Rockies. You see they're all bright at the north, and as you go south you only see a few bright dots. Those are the snow peaks. Those long, thin white lines in South America are the tops of the Andes, and the big, dark patches to the right of them are the forests and plains of Brazil and the Argentine. Not a bad way of studying geography, is it? If we stopped here long enough, we should see the whole earth spin right round under us, but we haven't time for that. We shall be in the moon before it's morning in New York, but we shall probably get a glimpse of Europe tomorrow." Zadie stood gazing for nearly an hour at this marvellous vision of the home world, which she had left so far behind her before she could tear herself away and allow her husband to shut the slides again. The greatly diminished weight of her body destroyed the fatigue of standing almost entirely. In fact, on board the Astronef just then, it was almost as easy to stand as it was to lie down. There was, of course, very little sleep for the travellers on this first night of their wonderful voyage, but towards the 6th hour after leaving the earth, Zadie, overcome as much by the emotions which had been awakened within her as by physical fatigue, went to bed, after making her husband promise that he would wake her in good time to see the descent upon the moon. 2 hours later she was awake, and drinking the coffee which he had prepared for her. Then she went on to the upper deck. To her astonishment she found, on one hand, day more brilliant than she had ever seen it before, and on the other hand darkness blacker than the blackest earthly night. On the right was an intensely brilliant orb, about half as large again as the full moon seen from the earth, shining with inconceivable brightness out of a sky black as midnight and thronged with stars. It was the sun shining in the midst of airless space. The tiny atmosphere enclosed in the glass dome deck space was lighted brilliantly, but it was not perceptibly warmer, though Redgrave warned her not to touch anything upon which the sun's rays fell directly, as she might find it uncomfortably hot. On the other side was the same black immensity which she had seen the night before, an ocean of darkness clustered with islands of light. High above in the zenith floated the great silver-grey disk of earth, a good deal smaller now. But there was another object beneath them which was at present of far more interest to her. Looking down to the left, she saw a vast semi-luminous area in which not a star was to be seen. It was the earth-lit portion of the long familiar and yet mysterious orb which was to be their resting place for the next few hours. "The sun hasn't risen over there yet," said Redgrave, as she was peering down into the void. "It's Earthlight still. Now look at the other side." She crossed the deck and saw the strangest scene she had yet beheld. Apparently only a few miles below her was a huge crescent-shaped plain, arching away for hundreds of miles on either side. The outer edge had a ragged look and little excrescences, which soon took the shape of flat-topped mountains projected from it and stood out bright and sharp against the black void beneath, out of which the stars shone up, as it seemed, a few feet beyond the edge of the disk. The plain itself was a scene of awful and utter desolation. Its huge mountain walls, towering to immense heights and enclosing great circular and oval plains, one side of them blazing with intolerable light, and the other side black with impenetrable obscurity, enormous valleys reaching down from brilliant day into rayless night, perhaps down into the very bowels of the dead world itself, vast grey-white plains lying round the mountains, crossed by little ridges and by long black lines, which could only be immense fissures with perpendicular sides, but all hard, grey-white and black, all intolerable brightness or inky gloom, not a sign of life anywhere, no shady forests, no green fields, no broad, glittering oceans, only a ghastly wilderness of dead mountains and dead plains. "What an awful place," Sadie whispered. "Surely we can't land there. How far are we from it?" "About 1,500 miles, replied Redgrave, who was sweeping the scene below him with one of the two powerful telescopes which stood on the deck. "No, it doesn't look very cheerful, does it? But it's a marvellous sight for all that, and one that a good many people on Earth would give one of their eyes to see from here. I'm letting her drop pretty fast, and we shall probably land in a couple of hours or so. Meanwhile, you may as well get out your moon atlas and study your lunography. I'm going to turn the power a bit astern so that we shall go down obliquely and see more of the lighted disk. We started at New Moon so that you should have a look at the full Earth, and also so that we could get round to the invisible side while it is lighted up." They both went below, he to deflect the repulsive force so that one set of engines should give them a somewhat oblique direction, while the other, acting directly on the surface of the moon, simply retarded their fall, and she to get out her maps. When they got back, the Astronef had changed her apparent position, and, instead of falling directly onto the moon, was descending towards it in a slanting direction. The result of this was that the sunlit crescent rapidly grew in breadth. Peak after peak and range after range rose up swiftly out of the black gulf beyond. The sun climbed quickly up through the star-strewn midday heavens, and the full Earth sank more swiftly still behind them. Another hour of silent, entranced wonder and admiration followed, and then Redgrave said, "Don't you think it's about time we were beginning to think of breakfast, dear? Or do you think you can wait till we land?" "Breakfast on the moon," she exclaimed. "That would be just too lovely for words. Of course we'll wait." "Very well," he said. "You see that big black ring nearly below us? That, as I suppose you know, is the celebrated Mount Tycho. I'll try and find a convenient spot on the top of the ring to drop on, and then you will be able to survey the scenery from 17 or 18,000 feet above the plains." About 2 hours later, a slight, jarring tremor ran through the frame of the vessel, and the first stage of the voyage was ended. After a passage of less than 12 hours, the Astronef had crossed a gulf of nearly 250,000 miles and rested on the untrodden surface of the lunar world.